Ancient Political Philosophy, Friday, November 13th, Friday the 13th, 2020. We're finishing up with the politics today and turning to Cicero's on moral ends on Monday in Book 1. So let's make a couple of comments on the last books of the politics. Book 5 turns to the subject of political revolutions and regime changing, and I characterize this in the notes as political science is medicine, the political philosopher is physician. What makes regimes sick, and when they really get sick, revolution, which is a kind of a death of a regime, and on the other hand also keeps them healthy. So this is, if you looked on the chartograph that I passed out for Book 4, which includes in the lower left-hand corner, or the upper right-hand corner, upper left-hand corner, kind of a layout of the politics. This is, I think that these books, the last books, especially Book 5, are what I call practical theory, or theoretical practice. They're Aristotle's directly instructing the founder, or the general term that he uses and that Lord translates is legislator. That is to say, the individuals who have responsibility for designing or guiding or preserving regimes. And that can be Alexander Hamilton or George Washington or James Madison or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, and it can be Abraham Lincoln. It can be contemporary office holders. In other words, I guess you could say that if the analogy to medicine and health and disease and death is consistent, you could say that every day you get up, every decision you make about how to live your life is also a decision about how to keep yourself healthy or give in to disease or decay. And at the risk of being repetitive, what I hope that the students in the class take away from this class, beginning with the Republic and also in Aristotle and then in Cicero, is the range of political actions that are open to political actors. That goes all the way from perfection, which I've already suggested in looking at the Republic. Even Plato and Socrates, who hold up perfection as a model, argue that it's probably not very attainable and that you probably, in human life, shouldn't look for such things. Short of perfection, there's improvement. I think on the whole, as I've tried to suggest in turning to Aristotle, that's really his game. That probably the most you can hope for in human life, both on the individual level. If men were angels, well, they're not, says James Madison in Federalist 51, as most of you know. And neither Aristotle isn't they're angels either. So set aside perfection. Turn to improvement. And if you can't improve, then perhaps you can prevent decay. If you can't prevent decay, perhaps you can slow down decay. And if you can't slow down decay or collapse of the regime, perhaps all philosophy can do is to help you understand what's happening, which is better than not understanding what's happening. So I think the analogy to medicine here means that just to repeat, Aristotle in both books 4 and 5 is pretty directly advising political actors as to how to either make things better or try to prevent them from getting worse. And so he begins with the issue of revolution, which I think I would define as the disease of a regime unto death, when that regime dies and is replaced with another regime. Revolution literally means being overturned, being turned upside down, which in political life, a revolution means the death of a regime. And that can, by the way, Aristotle discusses causes or beginning points or circumstances, and those can be internal or external. I mean, after all, the saturation bombing of Germany, Nazi Germany in World War II, led to the death of that regime. In some ways, the United States conquering Japan through dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the saturation bombing of Tokyo led to the collapse of that regime, even though the elements of that regime remained in place. But then the United States imposed, in essence, a democratic republic on regime. So regime change can come from the inside and outside. And Book 5 is mostly about the kind of regime that comes from the inside. Although Aristotle discusses in chapters 2 through 4, sometimes the causes can come from outside. And that's because chance exists in the world, as we'll see. So anyway, revolutions occur, especially in democracies, oligarchies, and polities, which, remember, democracies are all about equality, and oligarchies are all about inequality, and polities are all about a balance of equality and inequality. And to some degree, Aristotle suggests that revolution and regime change occurs, or decay occurs, when those regimes give in to their core principles too much. When Democrats want too much equality, or oligarchs want too much inequality, or polity loses its ability to balance between the claims of equality and inequality. And there's in some ways, one of the points here, and this is B on my notes, Roman numeral 1b, is that political change is driven by the complexity of human beings and their wants. And this seems to be especially evident when the demands for equality and inequality tend to revolve around property and honor, which can upset kingships and aristocracies. I didn't ask you to read the middle parts of Book 7, of Book 5, sorry. And as you'll see, he after discussing general issues of regime change, then he turns in the middle of Book 5 to the tendencies in the specific regimes. More about that, but we'll come. Yes, we'll come back to that. And then in chapters 2 through 4, he undertakes a complex discussion of the causes or circumstances, what he calls beginning points, or that's how Lord translates that can set off revolutions or cause change in a regime. And this goes all the way from kinds of events and developments like, again, sometimes embedded in the nature or character of regime, sometimes from outside it, that can lead to change or revolution. Arrogance of the rulers, probably that would be more typical in a kingship or a tyranny or an oligarchy. Desire for profit, probably a tendency in oligarchy. But also Democrats could overthrow an oligarchy in order to distribute the goods of the wealthy, to expropriate the wealthy. Disproportionate growth of one element of the population, dissimilarity in stock, what we would call ethnic or even racial differences or tensions, the location of a regime, and even small things like private grievances and conflicts. And I suggest you might want to take a look at Romeo and Juliet. We normally think of Romeo and Juliet as a play about tragic romance, a young love, but don't forget it. It begins and ends in civil strife, and the it remember it's about the inability of I know I forgot. Is it Venice? I think it's Venice. All those Italian cities look alike. Um, um, where the duke can't contain, or the prince can't contain, the civil strife, the civil combat, and you might look at the War of the Roses in Shakespeare's history plays, which I think are I mentioned later with oligarchies. Um, those are circumstances or beginning points that are internal to, but some of these are external too. And then the bulk of Book 5 is looking at the tendencies to corruption or decay peculiar to each kind of regime. This is kind of a sober teaching that's like Plato, Socrates' reminding you at the beginning of Book 8 that one reason even the best city, if it should come into existence, can't live forever is nothing lives forever. And that's why, again, this Aristotle's not a Marxist. I've talked about this issue before, but Marxism presumes that there can be a final rectification of the human condition, that when private property is overcome and of property is completely equalized and communalized among the masses, then Marx says politics will disappear from the human race, and that the entire human race will be unified in a simple administrative state that will redistribute or distribute, produce and redistribute the superabundance of goods made possible by technological conquest of nature. There's Marxism in a single sentence. Well, Aristotle says, sorry, everything dies. This is what Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Cicero, all of these ancient political philosophers believe that human life is tinged by sobriety and limitations, and that part of what the philosopher does is remind humanity of the limitations inherent in the human condition. And again, as I've said several times, this ancient political philosophic teaching is not utopian, it's sober. And, and all regimes die, so eventually a regime won't last forever. It will decay and turn into something else, or an asteroid will hit the Earth. And that's why even America, which has lasted 200 and almost 50 years, might go for another century or so, but eventually the American regime will either collapse or transform into something else, because nothing lasts forever. And part of what the political philosopher has to do, the student of politics, is has to learn how each regime has its own kind of internal decay. He, in chapters 5 and 6 and following chapters, I only asked you to read 5 and 6 on democracies and oligarchies. It can be disturbances in democracies, turbulence, anarchy, excessive desire for equalities. Those are all causes and tendencies intrinsic to a regime founded on the belief in human equality. Oligarchies, which are founded upon the rule of wealth and the unequal distribution of property, and the unequal distribution of offices based on wealth and property. It can be factional struggles among the wealthy families, like in Romeo and Juliet or the War of the Roses in Shakespeare's history plays, or even abuse, the arrogance of the rulers and abuse of the masses. I didn't ask you to read the chapters on aristocracies and kingships, but even those regimes that follow virtue can have tensions over honor and rule and access to rule, etc. And so Book 5 ends with, in chapters 11 and 12, and actually a couple of chapters before, with how to preserve regimes. Again, a doctor just doesn't tell you how to cure illness, but how to remain healthy. And I would summarize these last couple of chapters as his giving helpful advice to even to the bad regimes. How do you preserve a bad regime? By making it a better regime. His general advice is to preserve a democracy, an oligarchy, and even tyranny is clean up your act and moderate your badness and move to the common good. So even if you can't avoid a Hitler or a Stalin or a Dunn or a Voldemort, at least you can probably persuade them to make their rule less bad. Chapter 12 also includes a brief shot at Plato and Aristotle in Book 8 of the Republic, where Socrates, Plato, if you remember, lays out the typology of regimes as a process of decay, which matches the process of the decay of the soul of the individual. So aristocracy, which is the rule of virtue, which would correspond to a virtuous individual, where the lower parts of the soul, the erotic part or the thumatic part, actually, what begins to undermine the virtuous individual is the thumatic part of the soul. Remember, aristocracy in Book 8 of the Republic degenerates into timocracy, which degenerates into oligarchy, which degenerates into democracy, which degenerates into tyranny. And it's not that Aristotle doesn't think that there's insight in that thing, but his main correction is that, generally speaking, Socrates only portrays regime change going in one direction, down into decay. That a aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and Aristotle suggests, well, regimes can go the other way. Regime change can go from a tyranny into a democracy. So that's the minor correction, you could say, I think, of Socratic or Platonic political science as it's based in Book 8 of the Republic. I didn't ask you to read Book 6, but the theme of Book 6 is the best way of life, which is a discussion that carries into Book 7. And I think this is the restatement of the ethics and its relevance to politics. The same with Book 8 to some degree, too. If you remember in Book 2, Aristotle criticizes, remember, Aristotle discusses 3 theoretical regimes, 4 if you include the middle figure of Hippodamus, but Socrates, Plato in the Republic, Plato in the Laws, and Thales. And the criticism he makes of the Laws is that even though it's it's a more moderate version of politics that Plato eventually brings bit by bit the republic around, the laws around to the republic. And in a way, you could say the same thing of the politics. Remember, at the beginning of the Ethics, Aristotle calls the ethics and the politics a single work called the Politics. The ethics has to do with individual virtue and happiness. The politics has to do with political or collective uh, uh, happiness and virtue, the happiness and virtue of a city. Uh, and and so in Book 7 and Book 8, he brings the politics back to the ethics, um, and reminds you in Book 7 that the happy life, both for individuals and for cities, is virtue, activity in accordance with human excellence. Politics is part of the equipment of human happiness, because remember in ethics, Aristotle discusses even though happiness is an internal state, the activation of human potential, the perfection. Excuse me, I use that word perfection. The development of the activation of human potentials for virtue and excellence, which is what natural teleology, natural end directedness is. Um, so individual happiness and virtue is the individual bringing his or her own human nature to its fullest development, and that's exactly what political virtue, collective virtue is. And so he revisits those discussions that the best life is a kind of activity. Hold this in mind for when we turn to Cicero, because Cicero is going to affirm himself as belonging to the academic philosophy, which in the Roman world, as we'll see when we turn to this next week, is the Platonic and Aristotelian teachings about political science, which have survived as a school of thought. And and just a brief preview of Cicero. Cicero's going to criticize the two primary competing schools, competitor schools of thought in the Roman world, which are developments of Greek philosophy, Epicureanism and Stoicism. More about that next week. But generally speaking, Cicero will affirm, like Aristotle does in the Ethics and the Politics, that human life is an activity, an energeia. If you remember Joe Sachs's issues with translation. So happiness is an activity, and politics is the act of life. It means trying to live in the world and trying to have the effect on the world that I talked about at the beginning of this discussion, all the way from perfection to and so forth, improvement, prevention of decay, etc. But politics, like the virtue of the city, like the virtue of the individual, is an activity, and is part of the external equipment of the happiness of the individual. So the legislator, founder, the person that has political authority and cares for the regime, has to try to point his or her city in the direction of happiness. That's the aim of the politics, is to enable cities to be happy, which has happy people inside them. Um, and I think that will be reflected, especially in the conclusion of the politics in Book 8. So in Roman numeral 3, I turn to the politics in Book 8, and I characterize it as the concluding whiff of the ethics and of the Republic, but yes and no, as you'll see, and of the politics books 1 and 2. A preeminent concern of the legislature founder is to make possible the kind of virtue made visible in the ethics, as I just pointed out with Book 7, and restated in Book 7, by arranging properly the education of the citizens of the city. So the politics ends in Book 8 with a concern for the proper education of the citizenry of a city. And and I say in this sense, it's also reminiscent of Books 2, 3, and 7 of the Republic, in which once the city of pigs is formed and the division of labor in the Republic in Book 2, and the city is launched, and all those diverse professions lead to the abundance of material goods in the city and everything like that, then it turns out that you need soldiers, and then you have to look at the soul, and then you have to start caring about education. That's how the theme of education is launched in the Republic in Books 2 and 3, which include the reform of poetry, but if you remember, gymnastic and music. You got to have healthy bodies and healthy souls, and Aristotle, Plato, Socrates admit, as we pointed out, that music the science of harmonies is one of the external forces which penetrate as deeply as anything else into the soul. So Aristotle it has a whiff of that, which, and by the way, that's completed in the pyramidical educational system in Book 7 of the Republic. And here Aristotle turns to education as, in some ways, the a preeminent business of the legislator. And given the composition, and where does this come from? Because human beings are this complex mixture of body and soul. And so Aristotle, Book 8 concludes with a reminiscence of the concern for gymnastic and musical harmonies. But I want to make a couple of points. This is also a kind of a reminiscent of the inclusion of women as citizens in Book 1. Remember, we had that complex discussion of what Aristotle's teaching on women in the city is and women in the family. Just to remind you, the great mistake that crude, barbarian, non-Greek, but the Greek cities weren't much better about this either, as both Plato and Aristotle would admit, is the barbarians mistake women for slaves, and therefore husbands rule over their wives like tyrants, and women are completely excluded from citizenship. Aristotle says that's a mistake. Men and women are essentially equal, and the rule of husband over wife has to be political, of equal over equal, which is to say through persuasion and reason, admitting the reason and virtue of the wife, that they're partners, and not like parent and child or master and slave. And that means, even though the question of the women's participation in the larger institutional life of the city is complex and ambiguous in the politics, in the Book 8 it makes it clear. Education, you have to educate the citizenry, and that includes women as citizens. So it's a whiff of that discussion of Book 1. But echoing Book 2 of the politics, and this is why I think Book 8 is the proper conclusion to the politics. If you remember, and this is the sense in which this is an echo of his criticism of Plato in the Republic. The Republic over-unifies the city and turns it into a household. The true basis of unity is a limited unity. This is the teaching of Book 2. It's a conceptual unity. And this is reinforced in my discussion of the parts of the regime that come to full light in Book 3 and 4. And let me remind you of that. There are 4 layers or parts of the regime. The political system has, the constitution or regime or polity has 4 elements. A unity, a shared set of ideas which embody a notion of justice and human nature. In a democracy, that's that human beings are equal, and in an oligarchy, it's that human beings that are a superior human being is that being a good human being means being a wealthy human being. And by the way, let's make sure you understand the argument for wealth. Wealth means you don't have to work. If you don't have to work, you have the leisure to study and to develop yourself. Um, that may sound unfair, but that is the oligarch's claim to why the wealthy should rule. They have more time to study the goods and to pay attention to the needs of the common good because they are freed from the necessity of labor and work. They're more human than the poor. Now, I'm not advocating that idea, but remember, Aristotle's trying to get everyone to listen to everyone else. And so, in some ways, um, there is something to the claim that wealth generates a kind of liberty or leisure. If you can't have human life without freedom, you have to admit to some degree that the wealthy people are freer to pursue the development of the soul because they're not as limited by the necessities of physical life. Again, I'm not arguing that that's just or fair, but that's the oligarch's claim to justice. And in some ways, Aristotle's concern with education of all the citizenry at the end of the Politics is an attempt to moderate that, to make sure that all the citizens of a city have some access to education and development of their potential. But here's what this confirms as a whiff or reminiscence of Book 2. Let me finish the schema of the 4 parts of the regime, which I talked about in Book 3, etc., in Book 4. So you have the regime consists of a sharing of a common conception or a conceptual unity, right? Ideational unity. And then, of course, the institutions of rule that establish a ruling body of persons that hold power, and the arrangement of offices, and then the actions and laws of that regime in action, which create a certain kind of human being that's consistent with the shared vision of conceptual unity at the top of the list. And so in some ways, Book 8 confirms the limited unity of the polis. The unity of the koinonia, the commonality of the polis, the nature of that association is not a unity in all things. The purpose of the family and the household is to be a unity in the lower two elements of life. This is a reference to the cone, going all the way back to the ethics, the beginning of our discussion of the ethics. The two lowest functions of life are reproduction and nutrition. And that's what the family is a unity in. It's a uniship of kinity and body. It's erotic unity, to use Platonic terms, and the erotic needs of life. But the polis isn't a giant family. It's not to say that it can't concern itself with some elements. I don't think that Aristotle would disapprove of the modern welfare state, at least a limited version of it. Because there is a certain sense in which economics, and by the way, let me just remind you of something, that the word economics comes from the Greek word for household rule, household management. Oikos is the Greek word for house. Nomos is the Greek word for rule. Oikonomia literally means the rule of the household rule, which is economics, providing the physical needs of life. And to some degree, I don't think Aristotle would disagree that sometimes a city has to pay attention to those, but it can't provide them. That's the mistake that socialism or Marxism makes, according to Aristotle. So the echoing the limited unity which Aristotle establishes as the basis of the regime in Book 2, education then plays a central role in having the citizens share that conceptual unity, like the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools or something like that, which, yes, it indoctrinates. I mean, you could call it that this function of the regime is indoctrination. Um, but all regimes have to have some kind of commonality, or else it's not an association, as Aristotle reminds you in Book 2. And in Book 8, we see that education is the means by which the city establishes that unity, that limited unity that is the true basis of the unity of the city. It's a unity of mind, and hence education. It's not communism, and it's not, by the way, and this is the last point I want to make about the ethics, the politics, ethics politics, and this goes back to a concern that we first discussed in, say, Aristotle's mode of writing, treatises rather than dialogues. Um, um, and this will be part of the expanded narrative that I'll try to finish with when we finish next week the class. When political philosophy first comes to light in Socrates, political philosophy is both a necessity and a threat to the city, as registered in the laughter, anger, and eventual execution of Socrates by Athens. The activity that Socrates brings to the city is both necessary to clarify and to render theoretically visible human nature as a guide to politics, as opposed to the old divide stories of the gods conflicting and again, don't forget, this would also be included against the Bible and the Quran and all the other books of Revelation that humanity has adopted since pagan times. So the attempt of Socrates to bring the active definition of rational seeing of sameness and difference, so as to clarify nature and our being, so as to make individual and political life better. That's the task of political philosophy, and that's the same task adopted by Plato and Aristotle and Cicero. Um, and um, and but the problem is that also threatens the city, because in questioning the the shared opinions of the city, it deprives them of authority and subjects them to questioning and doubt. So you could say Plato takes up the mantle of this activity, but wraps it up in a complex form of writing, the dialogues, which both shield the political philosopher from persecution, but also protects the city. And as long as the philosopher can do what the philosopher does without damaging the city, and I think that's why the end of the Republic, you could say, is both a happy and a problematic ending. But at least you could say The Republic, as a work of political philosophy, begins with a religious celebration and ends with a religious myth. So Plato has found a way to do political philosophy which isn't harmful to the city, and as long as you can use the complex interpretive structures of getting to the heart of the dialogue, you can sing the song of the dialectic and do what the political philosopher does. And Aristotle, I think, accepts the task of political philosophy, the burden, the purpose of political philosophy, which is using reason to bring enlightenment to the human condition, both individual and collective, and but then writes treatises which are more practically available. So you could say Aristotle is trying to take political philosophy, maintain its its core task of making nature theoretically visible so that it can be useful to humanity, and with the accent that Aristotle seems to want to make political philosophy not only not harmful but more useful to humanity. And you can judge for yourself after working through the ethics and the politics whether that's more successful than the complex, if interesting, dialogues of Plato. Um, but um, but the including with education, I think it's the proper summary and conclusion of the politics in this sense. That, as I said, education points to the limit unity, conceptual unity of mind at the heart of the a city, um, and the thrust of the politics is, I think, to try to create a unity of law, um, especially in the form of the polity, the regime of the form of regime that is regime because it uses law as a way of unifying the polis, and a unity of common life and fate, but not communalized substance, by the way, and that's his embrace of the middle class, um, uh, which can understand the extremes of wealth and poverty without succumbing to either the radicalized wish for equality in the poor or the radicalized desire for unequal rule in the rich. So that then, I think, suggests that Aristotle understands the relationship of the philosopher to political life differently in some ways than with Plato. Because to go back to Aristotle's criticism in Book 2, that even if the laws of Plato is a more moderate version, it doesn't communalize the family, and you have some private property in the laws. Aristotle's point is that it ends with the nocturnal council, which is both men and women philosophically ruling the city at night, um, like a kind of an institutionalized version of the all-night discussion that the Republic was. And I'm just going to read from my last paragraph because I think it's well written. Aristotle's practical political science does not establish philosophers ruling over non-philosophers, but guides non-philosophic humanity into that personal access to virtue and the ethics, and those political arrangements in way of life that make self-rule and happiness possible for them, while the philosopher retreats to the role of advisor or perhaps professor. So, in a way, Aristotle's political science doesn't point to the rule of philosophers over non-philosophers. It uses philosophic advice and teaching to enable non-philosophers to attain that degree of improvement and happiness, which is the promise of human nature.